Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Outcomes and Metrics That Matter panel and webinar. Super excited to have you all. I can see folks are streaming in right now, so we're just going to take another few minutes to let folks get in and get settled. Please feel free to relax and enjoy. We'll be back with you in just a couple of moments. Welcome, everyone. We're just allowing everybody to come into the session. We can see the numbers are rapidly climbing, 400 plus and growing. So thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Feel free to relax, grab a drink, enjoy, and we will be right back with you. All right, we can see that folks are still joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started and cover some of the housekeeping so that we don't cut into too much of the conversation time with Lynn and Andy today. As all of you are likely very familiar, we are using Zoom webinar. If you have any questions, please pop them into the actual Q&A button down at the bottom. I have a team on the back end that will be collecting those questions. They're going to gather and compile, look for the common themes so that they can share that back out with myself and Lynn and Andy for later today. So as you can see, the chat is open. You're more than welcome by all means to introduce yourself. You're also welcome to comment if something is really resonating with you as the panelists are talking today. We welcome all of the conversation, but if you have a specific Q&A, please put it in the Q&A part so that we can actually capture that for later. We won't be able to keep up with all of the chatter that's happening in the chat function on the side. And yes, we will be recording today's session. So if you have any team members that are not able to join us, you will have a recording. You're more than welcome to share that with them after the fact. Okay, so today what we're going to cover, what we're going to talk about is the Outcomes and Metrics white paper that Andy and I co-authored a few weeks ago. Lynn Pasquarella was kind enough to write our foreword, and we're thrilled to be able to have her here with us so that we can have a discussion around the report and around what it is we believe is really important, which is making career very central to an institution's mission. So some of the highlights from the report obviously include some of the major trends that are shifting for institutions, things like virtual and hybrid, things like enrollment and how demographics are shifting, things like skills and what that means as we look at education and what that is going to connect for our students post-graduation. We talk a little bit about a framework for measuring outcomes and metrics that matter and what might be most critical for senior leaders to really know and or think about as well. And then of course, we also talk about 10 ways that university leaders can really position career services to thrive for the future. I've gotten a number of really great messages from partners already that have said that they've used this white paper to elevate the conversation with senior leaders at their institutions. If that is happening for you, we would love to know. So please put that in the chat. If you are one of the institutions that has used the white paper to start a conversation with your president or your provost or other senior leaders, we would love to know a little bit more about that. And we'd love to capture your name and your information so that we can follow up as well. So if you haven't downloaded the paper yet, please feel free to do so. And we're going to jump right into the conversation today. So without further ado, here are our speakers. Many of you know me already. My name is Christine Cruz Vergara. I'm the Chief Education Strategy Officer here at Handshake. And for those of you that don't know my background, I spent the past decade working in higher education prior to my role here at Handshake. We have Andy Chan, my dear friend and colleague. He is the VP for Innovation and Career Development at Wake Forest University. Again, I'm sure many of you know Andy and know all of his forward-thinking work that has positioned him in the president's cabinet for over a decade now at Wake, and of course, many institutions that have started to follow in those footsteps. And of course, we have Lynn Pasquarella. I'm a little bit fangirling here. She's just fantastic. We are so thrilled that she wrote our foreword for this white paper. She's done incredible work, not only as a president of Mount Holyoke, but now as her time as president of AAC&U. She has a bird's eye view of looking at institutions across many different dimensions and working very closely with presidents. So very thrilled to have her perspective in today's conversation. Andy and Lynn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, Christine. It's great to be here.
Excited to have you both here. So let's jump right into the conversation. I'm excited to get right into this. Lynn, let's start with you. You wrote our foreword. I loved the foreword. I loved what you talked about in your foreword. And one of the main tenets that you sort of explain to folks is that it doesn't have to be this either or. Education, higher education doesn't have to either be about educating the student and sort of creating this enlightened citizen, or about vocational training and making sure that they're ready for a career, but that it really can be both. And so you point out that there's also this consumerist narrative in higher ed that threatens to sometimes reduce higher learning to higher training, as you said, but that we also have to combat these concerns of higher education's value. And how do we restore that trust in higher education? So I'm curious if you could go into that a bit more and tell us sort of your thoughts about how do we balance that? How do we think about those two things?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly been a challenge. There's been a prevailing national rhetoric that's called into question the value of higher education in general and liberal education in particular. And it is a narrative that is on both ends of the political spectrum. So on the one hand, we have folks saying colleges and universities are bastions of liberal progressivism that are brainwashing the next generation of snowflakes that are going to melt at the slightest abrasion of their sensibilities. And there are those who are saying, I'm not quite sure that's true, but education is too expensive, it's too difficult to access, and it doesn't teach people 21st century skills. We need to pay attention to the narrative and address the concerns, whether or not we regard them as wrong-headed, because we have seen a dramatic decline in public trust in higher education. So we have to demonstrate the ways in which a liberal education is the best education in preparing students for democracy and in preparing them for work, citizenship, and life is going to move us forward, strengthen us economically, and help students achieve their goals. So one of the ways to do that is to provide data. At the same time, we also have to be visible in the communities in which we're located, and present with those we seek to serve. So serve as anchor institutions in our communities and show the ways in which employers now more than ever, as we look at the aftermath of COVID-19, the ensuing financial crisis, this moment of racial reckoning in our nation and around the world, the ways in which science alone isn't going to solve our problems, but it's the integration of learning and an application of these knowledge and skills to unscripted problems, of which COVID is emblematic, that are going to help us. And so employers are looking for graduates who can write, speak, and think with precision, coherence, and clarity, propose, construct, evaluate arguments, work in diverse teams, and be adaptable and flexible in the face of rapid change. And so these skills are at the heart of a liberal education, and that's what we need to make clear to prospective students and their parents and to employers.
Yeah. Where do you think institutions are failing at the moment in demonstrating that? Is it that they're not sharing data? Is it that the narrative is not clear? What do you think might be at the core of the issue and why people are even questioning?
Well, they're questioning for a variety of reasons. Traditionally, in times of economic recession or economic crisis, we see an increase in college enrollment. With COVID-19 and the financial crisis that followed, we saw a dramatic decline in college enrollment, particularly among students of color. So what we saw was the expansiveness of the digital divide, the food and shelter insecurities that so many students at all types of institutions were experiencing. And people thought, well, there's no point in my going to college to get job training or retraining because there are no jobs. And so we have to address the concerns that are at the heart of those people who are feeling like there is no hope. Education isn't going to help. We also have to address some of what Michael Sandel pointed out in terms of the stigmatization of the poorly educated as the last acceptable prejudice in the United States, and the ways in which those of us in the academy often operate as if we are in the ivory tower as a willful disconnect from the practical matters of everyday life. Used to be that higher education was a pastoral retreat for those who were going to go into the ministry or education. That's not the case. And we saw as far back as the Lincoln administration with the Morrill Act that it's to train people in the industrial, agricultural arts, to prepare them for thriving in work, citizenship, and life. And so we have to return and reassert our mission in higher education as serving a public good as opposed to serving as a private commodity and having it be tuition in exchange for jobs. That's not our purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we combat this sort of false dichotomy of liberal education or career preparation? There's obviously a lot of that rhetoric going around, and I know that you don't believe that it's an either or. So how do we combat that?
Well, we have to show the ways in which curriculum connects to career. There are many institutions, prestigious liberal arts institutions that do just that. Bates and its Center for Purposeful Work at Mount Holyoke, we had a curriculum to career initiative called the LINK program. But there are institutions across the country that are partnering with employers. Look at Miami-Dade, where when Eduardo Padron was president, his goal was to hand students a diploma and a job offer at the same time. Otherwise, he felt like he wasn't doing his job. So it's focusing our mission on what it means to be thriving in a 21st century world. And I don't know anybody who can feel like they have a fulfilled, meaningful life unless they have meaningful work.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that. I'm sure somebody will be quoting you soon, Lynn, with that with that statement. Andy, let's pivot a little bit into our article. So you and I had talked about writing this for a little while, actually. And part of the reason we had thought about it was because we recognize that over the past decade, both you and I have often been promoting the elevation of career services or career education, the importance of it at our institutions. But we've also seen the struggle that many of our peers have had in successfully doing so. And in large part, the senior leaders that we're often advocating to may not come from a career background, may not know anything about our work, and may not truly understand sort of what is best in class, what is not, how do we hold folks accountable, what metrics should we be looking at? And we thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with many senior leaders, many presidents across different types of institutions, as well as some major associations, to get a sense of what really are some of the metrics that matter and what should be measured after college. So Andy, if you could sort of summarize for folks on the line today, what are some of those metrics that we need to be measuring both during and after college? And what does that look like? Why are those in particular important?
Thanks, Christine, for that tee up. And I think one thing that you said that it'd be helpful for everyone who's out there listening is that these metrics are things that I think you and I have talked a lot about, but that they're things that were also added to based on these conversations with higher education leaders, people who were running universities or university systems. They were researchers who are out there thinking about ways to help higher education get better. And then people who've been in this work and field for a long time. So I just love the fact that we started with something, but we actually added a lot of expertise into the mix. And so these 4 buckets really are, when you think about during college, what oftentimes we tend to do is really think about student engagement. And those things tend to be around like number of students going to career appointments or maybe attending the career fair, of which we count that. And then we're always happy that the next year there's more, but maybe we don't even look at what's the percent of the total that we actually are getting to. And then even within that, of the different affinity groups or different demographic types of students, which ones are showing up, which ones are not. But we actually now, especially with your system on Handshake, we can track a lot of that. And so we have a lot more information around student engagement that is very valuable for sure. There's a second component, which is around career readiness. And I think that is one that has been elusive. It's really difficult to figure out how do we measure that, but it's one where we all do know there's certain things that students need to be able to do. Can we actually track that? Can we ask our coaches to be part of that process? Can we ask students themselves to give their confidence rating of being able to do these different kinds of things? I think we can do that. And we're beginning to do that at our school. I think a lot of other schools are doing that, whether you use the NACE competencies or whether you use the AAC and U competencies or whether you use the set that like what we're using, which are related to really just career readiness as it relates to being able to get jobs and succeed in your job. Then the third area was a new one that actually I think a lot of people talked about, which is social capital. What are the connections that students are making, recognizing that there is a big difference between those students who actually have already bringing social capital to the table through their families, through the schools that they went to, through the cities they live in. That's very different from the student who perhaps came from a first generation background or maybe from a zip code that actually wasn't quite as advantageous as another, that actually schools really want to see a difference in this area, and we can track that and figure that out. And the last one is just around experiential learning. What are schools doing that really show that students are getting work-related experiences? Most of the time, we've actually sort of let it be around this idea of internships. But there's all these other ways students can actually get work-related experiences as well as research-related experiences. There's a lot of work that Gallup's done that talks about that big, huge project that a student does that actually helps them have a work-related mentored experience that can make a big difference to them. So are we doing that? Are we really measuring that? So that's one big bucket, is what can we measure these things during college? I think we can. I think we all are trying to do a better job of it. One of the challenges for us, I think, is eventually we're going to have to figure out how to standardize on what it is we're actually measuring. And so my hope is that some of the work that I'm doing at Wake Forest, that I might be able to share with Christine, with you and the network at Handshake to see, oh, could these be an easier way that everyone could do the same thing without everyone having to invent their own way? The other things then go to like, what do we measure at graduation? And what's interesting is that most of the time at graduation, we're measuring, do you have a job, or are you in graduate school, and how much are you getting paid? And so those are nice metrics, but the hard part about it is, as we know, many schools have a hard time getting that data, period. You know, many schools are fortunate if they can get 30% of their students to answer the question. You have no idea what's going on with the other 70%. Again, your tool, 12, 20, some schools do Qualtrics on their own. Whatever you're using, you're trying to get to as a high knowledge rate as you can. But the thing that actually we started to recognize, and this really came out of these conversations with these different leaders, was that if you look at that list, there are 9 different things. And they're actually not just looking, did you get a job, but were you satisfied with the job? Did you need a college degree for that job? Did it align with what you studied? Do you know what skills you learned? And are you going to use those in your job? Do you feel like you are career ready? Did you have a network that helped you to get there? And then did you just feel like the value of going to college was worth it? If you actually had this data, a lot of the issues that I think Lynn raised would really get answered, because if the students themselves said, I got a great set of skills and experiences that led to a job that I'm happy with, that leads to eventually, future career growth that's a meaningful life, I'm in a good space. So you could actually say, especially if you're in one of those liberal arts types majors, here's proof of the fact that we actually did it. So we need more data than just, did you get a job? Because the one thing that people are really harping on is sort of the underemployability of college students. So actually, people are saying, oh, you have a job, but was it a job that actually even needed a college degree? I think we should be measuring that. And not to say that if it's not a good number, that's something we can't talk about. I think it actually is really helpful for us to be able to share that information and figure out how do we get better and what do we do about it. The last thing is this whole idea about, so 5 or 10 years after school, what do alumni see as the benefit of having gone to your school? I don't think we all do this very well. We don't do it very well at Wake Forest. I think we have a hard enough time getting the first two things done, which is during school, at the graduation. And so knocking one thing off at a time. We're trying to actually move down the curve and eventually get to a place where we can actually ask alumni, what are they thinking about how the value of their education 5 years after on many of the same dimensions. And this is another thing that I personally get excited about. Like I know with Handshake, eventually you'll be able to find ways for us to tap back into our alumni. Maybe you can help us actually get surveys from our alumni to actually get this kind of data. So I do think the future is really positive, but I do think having metrics is really important, because one of the issues is that we haven't historically measured enough, measure the right things. And so therefore we can't really report it back to higher levels of our administration to help them know what's really happening. I think we all can do a better job of that. And I'm really glad that we were able to get all this information from so many people and put this together for people to be considering.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you for running through those. I think, one of the things I'll add to that is there's one metric in particular that I felt very strongly about as we were chatting with folks. During college, I think it's really critical for institutions to think about how many of your programs, your academic programs, actually integrate experiential learning. How many of them actually integrate a built-in internship or research or study abroad or civic engagement or something where every single student actually has to go through it. And the reason I harp on this is I think there's a great question that's already in the Q&A around how do you define a best-in-class career center? Well, I think the broader question is actually how do you define best-in-class career education for an institution, not just the center? And the problem is most institutions are not thinking about this systemically. They're not thinking about it from a systems approach. They're thinking about it from a programmatic approach. And when you do that, you only serve a small number of students. How many students happen to come into your career center? 30% of the student population? Well, you're missing 70%, right? How many people participate in a particular program that might be for underrepresented students? A few hundred? You're probably missing thousands. And so how do you actually build in processes or support into the systems of the institution so that you don't have folks that are falling through the cracks? And I think as senior leaders, there's something that has to be looked at from that perspective. Lynn, I'm curious with regard to my very strong conviction around this and around sort of a systems integration. Are you hearing many presidents talk about that? Are you hearing many senior leaders say we need to do that?
Absolutely. There's an equity mandate before us, and the college presidents I know at all types of institutions are saying that we have to ensure that all students in every institution have access to high impact practices that you've just noted. We need to equip students to name and reflect on the skills that matter and be explicit about how these skills can connect to their career aspirations, regardless of their major. And we need to give students a way to tell their stories. So I think about Jeff Salingo's book a few years ago, There Is Life After College, in which he talks about the students who are most successful upon graduation as those who can tell a compelling story about how their curriculum connected to their career goals. Those were students most often who had the opportunity to take internships or apprenticeships that were directly related to their field of study and their aspirations, as opposed to low-income students who needed to take jobs at McDonald's or a local retail store in order to support themselves. And so we have to ensure that these equity issues are at the forefront of any discussion around curriculum to career.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're starting to see that trend. You're hearing folks focus and think about those components. We definitely need more of it. And I know it's a long road ahead as we continue to engage in these conversations. Andy, one of the things that current President Gordon Gee had a very interesting line in our paper about what he called blue water institutions and how those will be the institutions that survive over the course of the next few years. What are the biggest trends that you feel higher education is essentially facing right now that's causing this need for survival, that some will not make it and others will?
Well, I think there are definitely things you and I have talked about a bit, and I think you've really hit home many times. To me, you really give me ideas around it. And I do think one of those is, as we've talked about, is just demographics of sort of just the young population heading into universities today. It's more diverse than ever. And as a result, also we need to actually understand that generation of student, both in terms of diversity, but also in terms of just the way that they've lived their lives, most of them now with some kind of device in their hands since the day they were born. And so it's very difficult for most of us who are probably somewhere between 30 and 60 years old, trying to figure out how to communicate and teach and be in community with students who are 18, 19, 20 years old. So they always seem like they're getting younger, and I think I'm not, but actually I am getting older, and they're still staying the same age because they're always 18 years old coming into, or 19 years old coming into school. So I do think that's one big factor that we have to be very cognizant of, and we have to think about our overall practice. Back to your point about systems, we really do have to think about how do we flip our system so that we are not over privileging the privileged already. I think the second one is what we've experienced at COVID is that going virtual is the future. We knew it was coming, but COVID accelerated it and really sort of amped it up. It hit the inflection point to the point where now we see employers are recognizing, wow, I have so much more power going to schools across the whole entire country, finding individual students, targeting them directly. And I can do it without actually spending as much money as I used to before. That's the way organizations work. And we actually have to sort of co-opt with that, because of the fact is our students may not even be ready for the intensity of which these companies are coming at them and doing it in an online fashion. And so we have to figure out how to both be smart about it in terms of training ourselves on how to use these systems, but also knowing how to teach our students how to show up well, sort of in a virtual environment. So those are two of the big things that come to mind for me. I know that you have some other things that you've thought about. So I think I'll pass it back to you.
No, that's great. I think the virtual piece is really interesting too. And I'll kind of hang there for just a second. I'm on the alumni board for my alma mater, and I've been back a couple of times for board meetings this past year. And I have to say, I was struck by how strong the inertia was for folks to be back in person and to be back physically on campus. And yet at the same time, it felt like such a tension with what I'm experiencing in industry, where the majority of my colleagues, obviously my company as well, and the majority of the employers that we're working with are still very much virtual and have every intention of staying virtual or hybrid, but very much with flexibility at the core. And I know I've talked to a lot of colleagues in our field that have certainly some have griped about the lack of flexibility at their institutions in terms of what that's like going back. And I think one of the really important things for our profession in career services to really think about is whether we are in person or not in person on our campuses, we have to prepare our students for a world of work that is going to be more virtual and more hybrid than we ourselves as professionals may be experiencing on campus, because employers will expect that. And so to your point, Andy, how do you do that when your institution and your everyday environment may not be necessarily promoting that? How do you ensure that you are actually keeping up to date with some of those pieces? And I know Lynn was just talking about how effective her entire association has been being virtual, and that they're remaining virtual for the remainder of this year. And so it just raises a lot of questions, I think, that are super fascinating and super interesting. And of course, some of our research has shown that for women, for students of color, there have been some real benefits to virtual. And I know I was just talking with a colleague recently that was sharing how much she has appreciated not having to be in person because of the, quite frankly, daily microaggressions that she often faced, and how much time and energy was spent having to decide, do I address it? Do I not address it? Do I let it go? And she was like, working virtually, I haven't had to deal with as much of that. And she's like, and I've appreciated that break, And so I think those are some of the perspectives that we don't always hear if we don't personally experience them ourselves. But that is something to think about. Andy, were you about to jump in with something?
Well, noted in the chat, I think Lauren just made a point here about this idea where industry is ahead with respect to the use of technology. And I do think one of the pieces that we ourselves have to definitely keep up with that particular constituency, so we're up with it. The kinds of things that they're doing online with our students are things that we have never experienced before. So I think the fact that your firm is educating us on how to be ready for that is really very important and very helpful. And I think it's important for all of our staff members to actually lean in there and really get as smart as we can. Because I can definitely say this is that on the positive is that, more students from first generation and underrepresented backgrounds are actually more comfortable using virtual means to actually connect with employers than otherwise. So they're actually seeing it as a way to potentially build social capital, which is terrific. But the thing is that they also need some help to actually know, how do I represent myself really professionally? And so that's where we lead to this point of like, how do we make this experience, the career education, an essential part of the experience? So I think schools have choices. They can either say, I'm going to create career classes and give credit for it, which students will do all the work and they'll be prepared. So we actually have that, but we're trying to figure out how to get it to all students, which is tricky. So we are trying to think about, can we create asynchronous courses or asynchronous modules where students can still get the education, even though they're not in the 4-credit based class? That's sort of one way. Another way is you could create policy. So an example would be, you could say, hey, in order for you to be able to do on-campus recruiting at this school and you want to actually meet with the employers, you have to complete this career education module, so that you actually have to learn how to use these systems and understand what employers are expecting so you can show up well. I do think that's another way you can go. So it's credit, it's policy. You can make another policy would be, before you can declare your sophomore major, you actually have to do a bunch of career education stuff to make sure you're ready to go. But I do think it's those kind of things that schools have to be bold enough to say, we actually know better than you, student who's 18, 19, 20-year-olds, about what you need to know to help you get prepared for the world of work. And you have to do these things. And I do think that is exactly, I love it. Sarah just put it there, be bold. Like, I think schools and professors and we need to be more courageous at actually sharing the challenges of what the world of work is, the world of work our students are facing, because it is nothing like the way it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago when most of us were in school. Like, I think that's the thing, is that we forget, and then now it's actually accelerated so much. So, having a heart for our students where it's at. And I think it's really an interesting moment in time where leaders have the chance to really step up and say, hey, let's try to do something different here.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And there's a really great question that actually came from the audience that I'm going to give to you now instead of waiting till later. You had mentioned earlier that there are certainly a number of institutions that are thinking about sort of DEI, they're thinking about a wider systems approach, but there are still a lot of folks on the line right now that are struggling to get this message to their higher level administrators, and they would love to hear your perspective. What are other keywords or metrics or others in terms of how you catch the attention of the senior leaders that don't seem to get it yet, but they have the power to make these changes. They have the power to take a systems approach. But some of our colleagues on the line are still struggling to get that message across. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I mean, the bottom line always works with campus leaders. And we know that access alone isn't sufficient, that we have to provide places of welcome and belonging to all students for them to complete. We saw the most dramatic decline that we have seen in terms of first-year students among Black, Latinx men. And so there's a sense of urgency around addressing these issues. So I think in demonstrating that we have to teach students to apply the knowledge, skills, and competencies central to a liberal education within the context of a workforce, not apart from it. And use e-portfolios that allow students to demonstrate those skills and competencies beyond grades can be accomplished if we look at it from the equity perspective in relation to our overall mission. All of the activities of an institution should be grounded in mission, but also in terms of the fiduciary responsibilities. It's unethical to accept students who can't succeed. And many students are not in a position of being able to take courses that they think are a waste of time. And so we need to demonstrate why it is that we're asking students to do what we are asking them to do in order to get a degree. Otherwise, they will go to business and industry and get credentials and move on with their lives. And we will be poorer for that.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Andy, I'm curious, kind of staying on this theme, what do you think are the biggest obstacles that actually keep institutions from incorporating more of these career metrics or outcome metrics into their overall experience? What are those obstacles?
I think that at the end of the day, I love the way that Lynn just described those different issues. There's just the ethics of, bringing students into your school and what are you really giving them? What is our fiduciary responsibility related to that, actually helping people understand that the more clear it is that students are getting positive outcomes from coming to your school. You and I talk about this, that your issues of enrollment numbers, retention numbers, and completion numbers all go up too. They all go in alignment. I mean, there's research already enough where when students have career clarity and career confidence, their confidence in the classroom changes. They actually feel more positive about actually being in school and the purpose for being there. Their sense of belonging changes. Like there's so many positive things from doing it that I think for some reason, we're not able to push that up to the highest levels to get leadership to really say, wait a second, we need to tackle this from a systemic way. I think sometimes also, there are a lot of fires actually in universities, day to day, the kinds of things that come up usually end up preoccupying everyone's minds. And so I do think when I find that schools have decided they're going to make a significant part of their strategic plan, putting career readiness at the core or, side by side with their academic mission, then all of a sudden everyone's together. And so I oftentimes think about the idea of having your leader, whether it be your president or provost, say, hey, let's get the head of the career office and a few other key leaders around the university to come together and be a team and figure this out together and be part of, the career office has to do its part, but you're actually part of a team of academics, maybe people in admissions, maybe people actually in alumni, as well as in advancement. And all of a sudden everyone's like, hey, let's do this together. I think that's one of the things that we sometimes don't see enough of. And I'd say that the reason why this paper was so important is that oftentimes people aren't really clear as to what are we shooting for to achieve? Like, what are the metrics that we should be shooting for? And most of the times I think we just think, well, we just want to make sure students have, all our students have jobs at graduation. If they have jobs at graduation, that would be a great thing, which yes, that would be a great thing, but there's more to it than that. If we can be really clear about that, I think, the book by John Doerr around metrics that matter, measure what matters. I think, using a method of like objectives and key results so that we know what we're really shooting for, we can figure out the how if we know what we're trying to get to. But I think sometimes we actually focus a little bit more on the what should we do? How should we fix the career office? And then the outcomes will occur, but we actually need to know what outcomes are we really shooting for? And so I have found that model has worked really effectively on our team here at Wake Forest. And so it helps us actually make better decisions about what is the work we really need to do versus, sort of the essential versus the nice to have.
Yeah, definitely. I think you just gave me a great segue actually into something else I was thinking about, Andy, which is how can institutions really position career services or career education more broadly, not just the office, to really thrive for the future? What are those key considerations that you think institutions need to be doing? And what should those senior leaders be looking at?
Great. Well, we've been talking about these things, you and I, over the last decade, writing different white papers, whether it be mine on transforming the college to career experience back in 2012-13, or you and Farouk writing about the top trends and in career services and what are the key imperatives of the future. I think everyone should be looking at those white papers for sure. But I think we re-summarized it with the help of looking at what Jeff Salingo and Brandon Bastide talked about here. And on this sheet where there are 10 items, the way I would summarize it is that 1 and 2 are about leadership. And the biggest question to leaders are, do you have the will? Do you have the desire to do this? And do you have the will to actually try? If you want to do something, you can make it happen. But if you don't really want it and you don't actually embolden a team to do it, I think it will be tough to actually make any change happen. Number 3 is actually really tied to clear outcomes, clear metrics, how to use data, how to use technology. I think there's a lot of it here that's embedded. I know for me, honestly, until Handshake developed what it has, that it allows us to be able to track every single student, to know what their interests are, to be able to connect that to their outcomes, to be able to actually have, honestly, a data file on every single student so that we can see the difference between the experience of a first generation male versus first generation female. We can tell the difference between a student athlete versus a student who's on financial aid. Like, we have now powerful data at our fingertips that we should be able to use and be able to know how to intervene and help students who are not getting the same kind of experience as others. I think the one we've all talked about here is number 4, which is academic. Like, the more we can make this academic and make it then number 5, experiential, and tie those things together, students learn a ton. And we have to figure out how to do that more. It doesn't mean we all have to necessarily have like a co-op program like Northeastern, which is amazing, but we can do our own versions of that at our schools. But I do think that's important. So I do think that it's very interesting about all these different things is, we talk a lot about the university becoming sort of a lifelong institution of education for our alumni. I do think a lot of schools have a long way to go on that front, but I do think number 10 is actually what refers to that, and one that I think to the extent schools are actually thinking about that involving the career office in the middle of that team would actually be a good thing to do too.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lynn, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is wonderful. And I was thinking about the ways in which our report on how college contributes to workforce success that our VP for research, Ashley Finley, put together, focuses on employers' concern that while for the most part, they thought that college graduates were prepared to successfully enter the workforce, that they weren't prepared to advance in the workforce. And what was missing were the mindsets that were necessary in order for that advancement, the entrepreneurial spirit, the innovation, adaptability, and flexibility. And so I'm looking at this and thinking we need to emphasize that it goes beyond just the curriculum, but to the dispositions, the habits of heart and mind that allow people to succeed after college.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that. Lynn, let's actually stay with you for a second. So let's kind of, we have 15 minutes left to this chat today. And I'm curious your thoughts on, as we move forward, how much of this is really a shift in culture and what needs to change on campus to adopt this shift in thinking, to your point?
It's a shift in culture on some college campuses. I'm thinking about the free college movement right now at community colleges. And if community colleges are tuition free, four-year institutions need to focus on what that means in terms of articulation agreements for transfer, but also the ways in which they're going to keep pace with the innovation of the community college sector. Now, I know that there are some complications in terms of who's going to bear the burden of educating a broader population, given the state disinvestment in public higher education. But we have to shift a mindset. As I said, it was done at Mount Holyoke, and in many ways, it wasn't really a shift in mindset. It was faculty driven, and a recognition that we can bring in people outside of the academy, embedded practitioners, to talk to students about careers in journalism, in other sectors, in data management or data science, in law and medicine, in classes where the professors have spent their lives in the academy, not outside of it. I mean, there are professors of practice, but for the most part, especially in liberal arts institutions, people aren't trained to help others in the workforce. They're trained in their academic discipline. And so there was an embracing of this kind of innovative approach to helping students develop career possibilities, as I said, in terms of careers for the future that haven't yet been invented. So how do we best prepare students for a future that none of us can fully predict? We believe the best way to do that is through the liberal arts and sciences, but it must be done within the context of the workforce, not apart from it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm going to sort of put you on the spot, Lynn. One of the things that I have always felt fairly strongly about was faculty's involvement in the work around career. And not suggesting that faculty need to 100% change what it is they're teaching, the content of their work, but make a stronger connection between the content of their work, their pedagogy, and what that means in terms of the future of work for students. And some of the easiest ways is to literally explicitly draw that connection between, for example, why you've asked a student to do a group project or a verbal presentation and what skills they might be gaining out of that. And one of the things that I've often wanted or wished at the institutions that I've worked at was for faculty to actually do tours of service. And for every 2 or 3 years, they actually spend a few weeks, a few months, maybe a semester actually in industry. In any industry, it doesn't even matter, because the reality is liberal arts can be applied to so many different industries and so many different job roles. And for faculty to actually sit in those environments and be encompassed by them, and to have to see, oh, interesting, people are talking about X, Y, and Z. I can actually see how some of what I'm teaching could be connected in these ways, and to be able to bring that knowledge back into the classroom for their students. Is this a wild idea that you think will never catch on? Or do you think there's hope that maybe one day faculty could be more involved in this?
Well, I think we would need to upend our current tenure and promotion structure reward publication in peer-reviewed journal articles above all else. Many faculty are already consultants in business and industry in the workforce. They apply their knowledge and skills in their communities in service beyond the academy. But we have to have closer partnerships. There's no doubt between K through 12 business industry if we're going to shift the culture of institutions in ways that serve the needs of students.
That's great. Andy, you've obviously heard my piece about one of the entities that I think needs to absolutely be part of this conversation. Who else do you believe from the institution, from the university, should be thinking about this? How do we shift the mindset of those institutional leaders across a variety of different portfolios?
I always think that the combination of academic leader and administrative leader, generally, most universities, it's the president and provost, or it could be it's the president and the dean. I do think that's where it starts. I think there was a question in the Q&A about that, like, where does it start? It starts with the leaders, of which then you would bring in the other key people who actually might have influence. And so, part of what we're talking about here is who does the measurements? Is it institutional research, or are you going to let the career office do it? Good question. Who does the technology? Is it the IT group or the career office, or together? That's another one. Will you need additional resources? Is there a vision that actually we're going to need to get some additional resources to support what we're trying to do? Well, then we probably need fundraising or advancement to come help with us. Do we actually want to be able to talk about this with potential incoming students in a way that makes it show that we're being really super strategic here? What might that look like? I don't know if admissions has to be on the front end of this discussion, but they should definitely involved at some point, because they want to be proud of whatever the school has to offer and make sure that the career-related value proposition is communicated really clearly. So I do think those are the kinds of people who I think most of all. At the end of the day, you might have the dean, and then maybe there's certain faculty departments that are more likely to be more forward thinking on this, and that they're willing to work and partner with you to give you some models for success, that by proving the results, other departments might say, oh, if that's actually what you're doing, that's different than what I thought. Because a lot of times what faculty think is that you're trying to pass off the career advising function onto them, which is actually not really what you're trying to do at all. But I do think that you need to find some individual faculty members who would be willing to be your early innovators and adopters to be partners with you in this process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. It's faculty own the curriculum, and there is fear about the corporatization of higher education that sometimes is well-deserved fear. But faculty leaders can work with career centers to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, do you find that there are other entities on campus that could be really powerful catalysts for this conversation that we haven't really talked much about in today's conversation?
I'm certainly alumni, because most of them have careers. They're in the world of work, and they care deeply about their home institutions, their alma mater. And I think connecting students to alumni who can help them navigate the choices about what career to enter, how to get there, because students think that there's a straight trajectory when it's often not at all. So engaging them will help, and presidents and provosts are eager to engage alumni in whatever way they can in order to serve advancement and development needs. And so that's one group I think we should call upon increasingly as we move forward with our shared objectives.
That's great. One of the things, it's interesting that you bring up alumni. I've actually been thinking a lot about this recently myself. One of the things that in career services, I know we've often said is when it comes to networking and it comes to connecting with alumni, we don't want to give the student the fish. We want to teach them to fish, right? That's a very common phrase that we hear in our field. And it's one that I certainly subscribe to some extent. But when it comes to alumni connections, I find myself really shifting a bit in regards to this, in that I think as the world around us changes, and as we think about what is the value proposition of career education at any given institution, what is the value prop, what is the value add that you're giving to a student, or the value add that you're giving to an alum or to an employer? it's those relationships and it's those connections. And so I'm actually thinking more about the evolving role of career services as, in some ways, almost like agents. How do I actually connect you, Andy, to you, alum Lynn, who I happen to have a relationship with? Let me facilitate that introduction. Let me actually do that so that I can actually show a student experientially how that is done, right? Not just tell them how to do it, but actually show them how it's done, help them make that connection. And therefore they, as we help them do more of these, they can actually do more of that themselves. And I do think that now, obviously this is a challenge. I'm looking at Andy, you work at a much smaller institution. Your team's ability to do something like this might look very different than someone who works at Indiana University with many more students than at Wake, right? And so, of course, from my perspective, I'm thinking about it from a technology standpoint. Is there a way that we can ease that facilitation so that our very talented colleagues can actually do some of this at scale? How do we start to figure those pieces out so that we can show students, especially students who didn't come in with the social capital, to your point earlier, how do we actually start to model the way so that they can figure out how to model that for themselves moving forward? So yeah, I think that's interesting that the alumni piece is certainly one we should not forget in this conversation. There are a few questions that have come in, and I want to make sure we get to at least a couple of them before we have to close off today. The first question is, I'm being asked by my president to consider how we might become a world-class career center, which begs the question, what defines a world-class career center? So Andy, why don't we start with you? And Lynn, if you have any thoughts, please feel free to chime in after Andy.
Great question. And I think that the number one thing that I think about is less about the center than it is about what's the outcome we as an institution want to achieve when it comes to thinking about our students' career goals and aspirations. And so we keep it pretty simple. One is that every student is career ready. So back to the point you just made, from the standpoint, and we like to say career and life ready. So from the standpoint of every student, do we care about every student? Do we want to know that every student's ready to go? And have we defined what that looks like? If we actually could do that, we could say, let's all figure out as a school how to do that and what role the Career Center plays to help make that happen. That's one. And the two is then that they have appropriate or great experience while they're in school that lead to a positive first destination outcome when they get out of school. So what is the outcome that they're going to get? I think most students either want to have a job or be in graduate school. Yeah. And so that's really what they want. I want to make sure that that's happening. Then everything else that happens underneath it is mostly about, like, how do we structure and shape ourselves to make that happen? What I would arguably say, every school has their own idea based on, first and foremost, the culture of their school, the constraints of the resources that they might have, and thinking very creatively, systemically about what is the way we can achieve these goals so that everyone in the school who actually has a part in this can actually participate in it, of which the Career Center is some big part of it, right? I think what happens, we tend to look at it like the old model has, we have a set of career coaches, we have a set of employer relations people, and maybe we have some operations people in the middle. And so we just run the center like that. And I actually will say, I'm very fascinated. I'm actually, we're a big part of this program we're putting out called Kaplan Career Corps, and we have a bunch of early schools who are in it. One of them is Point Loma. And they basically said to me, they said, hey, we're actually starting our center and we're going to do it totally differently. We're actually, all of our managers in our center are all basically under 30, and they all actually are project managers, no counselors, because Career Corps provides the counselors and Career Corps provides the career education. So we just actually want people who are either managing projects and events or helping create the network that you just talked about, the network that actually is designed to help activate all of our alumni and employers to help be in touch with our students. That's a totally different model. I've not heard that before. I'm championing her to the hilt because it is so cool. They're trying to do something different. Yeah. But I do think that's the kind of thing people have to be willing to do. But as long as you stay with the old, I need more counselor model, you'll never succeed. There's no way you can get enough counselors to actually help all the students you have on any campus.
That's right. Lynn, you used to be a president. How would you answer this question?
For me, it gets back to giving students a way to tell employers their story. One of the best ways to do that is through e-portfolios. We know from our surveys at AAC&U, employers aren't as interested in transcripts as they are demonstrations of students' work. skills and competencies. And so if you can, through career services, through majors, through first year capstone experiences, have students tell their stories, reflect on their experiences and how they connect to their career goals, that will best serve them. And career services can do this through helping students reflect on curricular and co-curricular experiences in a way that is cohesive and builds a narrative that they can tell to employers upon graduation.
I would love to build upon that, Lynn. I think, what's really interesting is sometimes the value of those portfolios is even less the actual work in the portfolio and more the process of how you got to that outcome, right? The learning that came out of that, because it allows a student to more succinctly and more concisely articulate what is their value, what are their strengths, and what are they bringing to the table. And I'm thinking about how many employers nowadays, as they're looking through so many different applicants, how do they do that at scale in a really quick way? And one of the most important things for our students is to have a strong online presence, right? What does their Handshake profile look like? What does their LinkedIn profile look like? And do they have a really clear synopsis around some of their learning and their work and the connection that can be made to the industry or the job role that they are trying to do?
Right. And this gets back to the points about that Andy made about social and cultural capital. Many students just don't feel comfortable doing that. And so we have to empower them to do that and by requiring them to do it as an essential component of their education.
Yeah, the requirement piece is so huge. I'm going to kind of dig into the tactics here really quick. Andy, this one's for you. Do you envision any other methods for collecting this data, all of the wonderful data that you talked about, besides surveys? This person said surveys are kind of going the way of the dinosaur and people are just fed up with them. Plus the problem of positive response bias. What about partnerships with the IRS or the state UIs? What do you think about that? What's your perspective on that?
It's interesting. I happen to notice in the chat that someone from Florida said they're actually creating a requirement in Florida about career readiness. And so I do think that there are some states that are moving down that pathway, which may be very interesting to see. I think the challenge sometimes is these things sometimes get created in the governmental world and they're not necessarily like in partnership with the people in the institution. They're actually just mandated from the outside. So it would be nice to actually be in partnership to be able to make that happen. So I think about that. I think that it's really interesting. You and I've talked about this, is that I feel like we're still in this sort of phase of this life cycle of what we're talking about, which is still like early, chapter 2 in a 20 chapter change. And so as a result, we're trying to figure out what really is right and how much actually has to be unique to each institution versus it should be mandated and everyone has to do the same exact thing. And I'm not sure what the answer is on that. I tend to like in the early stages of innovation to allow a lot of things to bubble and see what happens and see what sticks, and that eventually things coalesce over time and you have this huge inflection curve and everyone's like on board. So I'm less of a mandate this, make everyone do it right now, because that scares people actually, really truthfully. And so I think that that's sort of one way. I also think that around the survey issue, I think part of it is that I think we have to start with surveys mainly because it's difficult. I mean, we looked a lot at Wake Forest at a lot of ways to figure out how we could measure it sort of objectively with outside points of view, but we actually, for example, thought, oh, our employers could help give us ratings. But it's amazing when you actually talk to different employers, they all have different views about how they rate students too. So it's not like they're all going to agree on the same kind of sort of really strict rubric that actually we'd all want to agree with. So there is this other piece. I know we said like positive ratings, self-ratings, but to be honest with you, you meet students when they actually do a lot of this work, and a lot of them are as negative about it as they are positive about it. Like I think some of them think they're great, and then you tell them and you show them what really good is, and they realize that they're not. I think that's part of maybe the process, is making sure that you've given them the example of here is what like pretty good is, and here's what outstanding is, and now compare yourself relative to that, as opposed to like, are you good at this or not? But I do feel like we have a whole host of students who come into our offices and say, I'm lost, I don't know what I'm doing. And then you meet and sit down with them and they actually are better off than they thought. So it's hard to know about that positive bias issue. We're starting in this place because we actually need to try to get data from the student period. And we're going to actually use some very innovative surveying methods to get like short, quick survey information from them. And then on the other side, we're actually asking our coaches who meet with students and are career educators who actually teach students give their grades of the students to us, so we actually have more data points to like give a sense for like where is the student relative to where they think they are. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work still to do in this area, but we got to keep trying. We got to try something and not overthink it.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I know we are at time. I don't want to keep folks. There was a quick question about, is Handshake actually considering ways that might be able to assist centers around the connections with alumni? The short answer is yes. More to come on all of that, but we are thinking very heavily about the ways in which the field and the profession is continuing to evolve given the changing pressures around us in higher education and the world of work with employers. And there are many things coming down the pike, not only this year, but in 2022 that will help to address some of these components. Lynn and Andy, thank you for your expertise and for your thoughts. So appreciate the conversation. Thank you to everybody that could join us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.